Let's begin with a short prayer. Father, we ask your blessing and care as we work as a community to eliminate this virus and at the same time come out of it and gather a community together again. We ask this in the name of Jesus the Lord. Amen. The period that we're talking about now, if you remember the date we were on, was 1122. And the emperor is in Germany, the Holy Roman Emperor. And what happens during this period is that the structure and the organization of the church begins to look very much like it does today. And the basis of the church was formed very strongly by lay people. And it's interesting that lay people had a clear understanding that they performed two sacraments. And the two sacraments a layperson performs are baptism and marriage. It's funny how few people today realize that the sacrament of marriage, the priest is a witness, and that the woman confers marriage on the man, and the man confers marriage on the woman. But it's a sacrament a priest cannot confer. A priest can't do that. A priest is a witness for the church. So they had the sense of that. It's true today, but we don't have much of a sense of it. And the other thing is baptism. When people studied baptism at this time, and I'll just take you back, because when I was a youngster, it was much like this. When part of preparing, when you studied baptism in school, and we would study it in grade school as part of the catechism, we were trained how to do baptism. It was seen as very important that you knew how to baptize a person in case there was an emergency, someone was dying or something like that. And I know nurses who have a sense of that today, that if a baby is born in serious straits, the nurse knows how to baptize and stuff like that. But it's not normally understood today. I think lay people understand a lay person can perform baptism, but they don't learn how to do it today. At this time they did. And they had considerable say in the managing of the finances of a parish. I think you know that when you deal with finances, there's two sides to finances. One side is the spending side, and the other side is the income side. And very, very often in places, parishes I've been in, where the two are very disconnected, so that the, let's say the pastoral council or the pastor, just singularly when I was first ordained, was really responsible for spending money, and he would carry that on. Whereas there is a financial group in the parish who takes the collections, everything. And when I was a young man, again, it was the Holy Name Society. But today we have a financial structure in the parish that is responsible for making the collections and counting them, this sort of thing. But at this time in the church, all income was counted and taken care of by lay people, and the way it was spent was largely decided by a council of the lay people who collected it, plus the pastor. But he would be on this council. And so lay people were really in charge of both the income and the expenditure. And as you probably know from home finances, it works best if the same person, same group, is in charge of both spending and collecting. The clergy presided over the liturgical life, and the chief authority in the area was the bishop. And he shared this, this mission with the local clergy. Now again, when I was a youngster, the liturgical life was largely in the hands of the pastor of the parish. And you had to do something very, very wrong for the bishop to intervene. I mean, that just didn't happen. The bishop had virtually nothing to do with the liturgy in a parish unless something really crazy was going on. At this time, the pastor was basically in charge, because again, the bishop's away, but the bishop saw his office as presiding over the parish in conjunction with the clergy of the diocese. So the clergy of the diocese, and particularly the pastors, formed a body that worked very closely with the bishop. That will be mirrored at this time. That will be mirrored in the Pope with the cardinals. That's sort of the way they worked at the time. Metropolitans or archbishops were overseers of an area larger than a diocese. Metropolitan, the term metropolitan, basically comes from the Eastern Church, whereas we tend to use the word archbishop. But a lot of archbishops have the title metropolitan because it's historically connected with their diocese. So, but anyway, they would have authority over areas larger than a diocese. Bishop over a diocese, metropolitans, archbishops are over a larger diocese. Primates were bishop spokesmen for an entire region. The primate for, let's say, the United States is the bishop who's elected head of the Organization of the American Bishops. And in each country now, the bishops in that country have an organization that administers the country as a group. And that group, they elect a head, and that is the primate for the country, recognizing the authority. Now, understand, when we look at holy orders in the church, we have deacons, we have priests, and we have bishops, and that's it. Now, once you get to bishops, we talk about these different titles. So an archbishop still has no more authority than a bishop. He's just over an archdiocese, okay? And a cardinal has no authority over other bishops. The thing is, the Pope is immediately over all bishops, and then the bishops are immediately over the priests. And we have it in that way. Priests and deacons are under the bishop. So there's a structure like that. We used to have a similar thing with regards to priests, where we had monsignors. Now, if you're a pastor or non-pastor and made a monsignor, you have the title monsignor, but a monsignor isn't in charge of the other priests. In fact, at one time when I was pastor of the mission, one of my associates was a monsignor. He wasn't the pastor, but he held the title Monsignor. He had it from another diocese when he came here. Over all of this was the Pope, and at this time, the Pope became one of the central figures in Western Europe. Now understand, the Pope is to a bishop. He's the bishop of the city of Rome. And so he has this authority that came to the Pope over a long period of time. But the Pope is considered a bishop in the liturgical sense. He's a bishop, but he has the final authority over the entire church. So the Pope had many helpers from many fields who assisted him in carrying out his work. And what he would do is assemble these people. An example would be, I'll use the idea of Pius XII. When Pius XII wrote a letter, an encyclical, to the church, Pius XII's encyclicals, if you were not in the field to which that letter was written, you couldn't read it. So if he wrote a letter, let's say, on the use of medicine, because he did several letters on medicine while he was Pope because of certain things that were going on in the medical field. Well, if you weren't a doctor or a nurse or in the medical field, you really couldn't read it because you couldn't understand it. And the fact is, Pius XII had a panel of doctors who worked with him when he did it, and they wrote it specifically for doctors. They carried his ideas and everything, but it was in the language of doctors or of lawyers or of scholars or of whatever. And these encyclicals went out this way, but they're the work of the Curia. This group of people gathered around the Pope and would carry the Pope's ideas very formally into these different fields. The first really encyclical that I would call a popular encyclical was John the 23rd's encyclical, Pacem in Terris. Pacem in Terris, Peace on Earth, was written specifically for people to read. And Pacem in Terris reads very, very well. but it did come out of the Curia too, but it's written for people in general. The most important change, as far as the church is concerned, in this period actually comes about with regards to the cardinals, because it is from this point on that the cardinals will actually be the electors of the Pope, and then will work closely with the Pope in administering the worldwide church. And again, like in the Curia, you'd find a number of the cardinals in the Curia, depending on set fields they're in. There are cardinals who are experts in ecumenism, relating to other religions. There are cardinals who are experts in sacred scripture. There are a number of scholars that are in the College of Cardinals, and they would be in these different fields. But the cardinals as a group will then aid the church as this goes on. The 12th century also would see a growing interest in reforming the church in many areas. And at this time, there became a growing dissatisfaction with religious organizations, and many new ones came into existence. Now remember, at this time, basically the main thing we're looking at is the Benedictines. The Benedictines and the Rule of Benedict was basically what we're talking about is monasteries. And then outside that, we're going to talk about the people working in parishes, the diocesan clergy. The idea was people wanted to see greater holiness on the part of the diocesan clergy, and at the same time wanted to see greater ministerial work on the part of monks in monasteries. It's also, and I've probably mentioned it before, but the primary work of a religious, and you go into a religious order, the primary work of a religious is your holiness. You try and become a very holy person. And that's a responsibility of the abbot or whoever is head of the religious thing, to encourage and help everyone to become a holy person. That's what you're supposed to do. Diocesan priesthood, the priest's purpose in a diocese or a parish is the holiness of the congregation. So he's supposed to be about the holiness of the congregation. And in the documents of Vatican II, you discover that a priest is supposed to come to his holiness in the process of working for the holiness of the congregation. And you could almost say that the priest is supposed to work for the holiness of the parish and as a consequence become holy. Whereas in the monastery, the priest or religious or whatever is supposed to work for holiness and as a consequence make other people holy. Okay, it sort of works that way. But at this time, people were very dissatisfied. The monasteries were pockets of holiness, and there didn't seem to be a whole lot going on with regards to that in parishes, which are very big organizations, require a lot of work and this sort of thing. And you can get completely lost in the organization of a parish and not think about other things. So at this time, a whole bunch of different religious communities came into existence. The first one is Bruno of Cologne. And most of these founded around, I'm putting Bruno at 1065. But anyway, Bruno founded the Carthusians in France. We don't see a lot about the Carthusians here in the United States. There are monasteries of them. But if you go to France and tour France, their monasteries are in ruins because of the French Revolution. But most of the monasteries in France are actually Carthusian monasteries. They were all over. There are several in England that were destroyed by Henry VIII, and a lot of them in Europe, but mainly France and England, and they were everywhere. They were an amazingly popular order. He had been in charge of, Bruno was in charge of the cathedral school in Cologne, Germany. And one of his students became Pope Urban II. And when Urban became Pope, he looked at Bruno. And Bruno was a person who wanted a rather strict life. And so he left the cathedral school, and he went off to the Valley of Chartreuse in France. I think you know that there's a famous liqueur that's produced from there called Chartreuse. So, and there he founded a monastery. Incidentally, they're the ones who invented the liquor. So he founded the monastery, and he wanted a very, very strict life. He had absolutely no intention of founding a religious order. His Holiness became rather famous and everything. So the Pope, who'd been his student at one time, brought him to Rome, and he was called to Rome to found a monastery. And he founded a Carthusian monastery there. And then he also founded one in Calabria, where he died. Both these places are in Italy, Rome and Calabria. So he founded these two monasteries. So now we have three monasteries, Chartreuse, Calabria, and Rome. And these three monasteries, and he dies. The prior of the first monastery, the one that is in the Valley of Chartreuse, composed a rule. Now remember, Bruno wasn't founding an order, so he didn't write a rule or anything. So this man wrote an order, a rule, but it was founded on the way Bruno lived his life. So Bruno had strict times for prayer. That was written into the rule. Bruno had a strict division of his life in the way he worked, and Bruno was much more of a scholar, obviously having been at the cathedral school. He was much more a scholar than a workman. At this time, if you go into Benedictine monasteries historically did not receive donations. Historically, the Benedictine monasteries supported themselves by farming and that sort of thing. And over a period of time, they began to found schools at the monasteries because they were, again, the best educated people. But anyway, Bruno built a life that was built on penance. He did very specific penances. And it was also founded on solitude and poverty. So there's a lot more solitude involved. And the life he led actually was far more reflective of the very early monks of the Eastern Church. We call them the Desert Fathers. They went off to live alone and this sort of stuff. And they were founded on solitude and penance. Remember, in the early church, the idea of penance was because in the first 350 years of the church, the terrible persecution, so many people died as a result of persecutions and stuff like this, that it became integrated into the church that you needed to have a life of suffering. And as life became easier, then monasteries began to impose suffering, long fasts, periods of silence where no one spoke to anyone for a period and stuff like this. And so, but this is very much from the Eastern Church and the early monks. And then this became the norm in the Carthusians. And so the Carthusians are seen as a stricter order than were the Benedictines at this time. Another order was founded in France by a man by the name of Robert of Molsum. These came to be known as the Cistercians, after an area in Certeau, an area called Certeau in Burgundy, where they settled. The third of their abbots was from England. His name was Stephen Harding. And under his leadership, the Cistercians became a very powerful force for church reform. So you notice that what we see, there's this need for reform. So what we see in Bruno is Bruno goes about personal reform. And people are interested in that, so monasteries are founded about, and they come into it. Now this man is interested in church reform, so that his people would be about reforming the church as a structure in a certain area. This move for spiritual renewal began to be felt very strongly by diocesan priests. Now, many diocesan priests at this time already lived in small communities. An example would be, if we were to take San Luis Obispo. In San Luis Obispo, there are 3 Catholic churches. And there's also about 6 in neighboring communities when we count things like Los Osos and Pismo Beach and stuff like that. But what they started doing in many areas was all the priests would live in one area, and they would have a common home. So they had kind of a monastic life, but they were in fact diocesan priests. And they picked up a rule from one of the monasteries. They would take the Benedictine rule or the Cistercian rule or the Carthusians. And they came to be called canons. And in Latin, the word for a law is canon. And so these people were called canons, and they lived according to a rule. Now, the rule was not the same for the different canons. They picked the rule they wanted, but they came to be called canons. Priests who were helping the bishop would live near the cathedral and came to be known as the canon chapter. When I was a young priest again, it was very, very common at a cathedral to have a chapter of canons. And the chapter of canons at the cathedral would live kind of a monastic rule. And what they would do is, in the cathedral itself, they would do the hours of prayer that are part of the office for the priest. But they would do it publicly and people could attend it. And what normally happened in the chapter of canons, they were priests who worked in the chancellery. So they needed to be close to the cathedral anyway. And so there were several of them there. So they would form these communities. When they lived some clearly established religious rule, when they followed some clearly established religious rule, they came to be called canons regular. So like if we were to form a group of canons and we were to say we're going to follow Benedict's rule, we would be canons regular. If they were without a rule, they were called collegiate canons. And a collegiate canon would be if we got together and formed a community, made up our own rule. Okay, they would be collegiate canons. And both men and women were members of these communities, and men and women, of course, lived in separate homes. But both men and women would be part of this community. In Germany, 1121, a young German nobleman became a canon. But in his area, the clergy resisted reform. This young man's name was Norbert. And so he was bothered by the fact that where he was and the canon thing he was in, they were against reform. And what would reform take? Reform was that they would spend more time in prayer, this sort of thing, and lead more regulated lives. So he founded a house of canons regular, and he followed the rule of St. Augustine. One of the interesting things about the order that we know as the Augustinians, the order of the Augustinians is the only order in the Catholic Church that was actually founded by a pope. And the Augustinians were founded not by St. Augustine. St. Augustine lived in about the year 400. But what the Pope did was take the rule that Augustine wrote. Augustine had a very, very interesting rule for a community. He had a community of people around him, and they followed that rule. But he wasn't founding an order or anything, and it sort of dissipated after he died. But the interesting thing about Augustine's rule that is very, very different than other rules is St. Augustine's community was based on the friendship between the people who participated in the community. And in a period, we call the period where a person decides whether or not they want to be a part of a community a postulancy. You look and you see whether you'd like to be part of a community, and then you live in a community for a while, and that's called a novitiate. Now, these two things, what you would find out is whether the people wanted you as a friend and whether you wanted to be their friend. And if that's what you wanted, then you became part of Augustine's things. But Augustine's, most religious orders, we will notice, are founded around a mission. So they do their farming or their prayer or their teaching or their whatever, and you go into it to do that particular work. But Augustine's community was founded on the people who formed that community. And that's one of the reasons why it was so powerful when Augustine was about it. The people there really liked one another, and they all participated in it that way. There wasn't so much a structure of authority. As the house was located in the area of Prémontré, France, they came to be known as Premonstratorians. Okay? These people worked in parishes, but lived in a monastery. And see, again, now we see the blending of diocesan priesthood with monasticism. These men worked in parishes, but they lived in monasteries. And in this way, they combined the work of parish priest with that of a monk. I should tell you that the Premonstratorians still exist, and there's a couple of monasteries of them in the United States. There are more of them even in Canada, I think. But they're called today popularly, we call them the Norbertines, okay? And they have a more religious life, but the work they're about is parish work, okay? In this period of reform, lay people became more aware of their roles in the church. We go through periods of this. When I was a youngster again, there was a very, very strong feeling of the way people were involved in a church. And if you were to go into the parish that I was in Pacific Beach in San Diego, you would discover that every year, all the men in the parish made a retreat. And every year, all the women in the parish made a retreat. And I remember my mother would go for a week, my dad would go for a week, and there were maybe 10 different retreats a year, and you could go on, men would go on the men's retreats, women on the women's retreats. They'd go to different religious houses in the area, retreat houses, and they would do this, but this was done yearly. All the women in the parish were a member of a group called the Altar and Rosary Society, and they maintained the church, they cleaned the church, did that sort of thing. And the men were all members of what was called the Holy Name Society and or the Knights of Columbus. And this men's group in the parish that I was in, for instance, there was a Holy Name Society that was really responsible for all the stuff in the church. They collected money for repairing the church and all this sort of thing. They did that. But exactly the same men were all members of the Knights of Columbus. And the Knights of Columbus was involved more in international funding and stuff like that. But the Holy Name Society was the parish itself. And again, they were exactly the same people. So people began to form groups to prepare, to care for the sick, provide hospitality, and looking after pilgrims. To provide hospitality was to take care of people who are in trouble, homeless, that sort of stuff. So they would do that. And care of the sick, at this time, hospitals and stuff were not a big deal. They existed, but they were not really a big deal. If you were that sick, you went to a hospital, you normally went to die. So these people began to help and care for the sick people. As you know, today, I think the coronavirus is a very good example of that. Sickness is a very complex thing, and it needs to be dealt with by society. You just can't deal with it individually. And as a youngster, for instance, if I got flu, both my parents worked, but then my mother had to take a leave or vacation or something to take care of me while I was home with the flu. And she had to take care that I wasn't spreading the flu with other people and this sort of thing. And then you're faced with smaller income and the types of things that go on. So it became a very complex thing. So this idea of caring for the sick had to do with babysitting, maybe. It had to do with being involved in medical work, all kinds of things. But the care of the sick was a very complex thing. And finally, looking after pilgrims. At this time in history, pilgrimage was a very big part of people's lives, and people went on pilgrimages everywhere. It's really interesting to me when you study the Muslim community. For them, a pilgrimage is to go to Mecca. And if you look at the Jewish community, for them, a pilgrimage is to go to Jerusalem. But what happened in the church, in the early days of the Catholic Church? All the members of the church were Jewish. And so they would go to Jerusalem every year for Passover. And the Christian Jews who went to Jerusalem would then begin to look at the places that were important to the life of Jesus as well while they were in Jerusalem. And when the break between the Jews and the Christians was complete, and we talked about that a long time ago, which was the Bar Kokhba revolt. But when the Bar Kokhba revolt occurred and the break between the Jews and the Christians was absolute, well, Christians were still in the habit of going to Jerusalem to see the sights of the life of Jesus. But when the Muslims took over Jerusalem, the first conquest of Jerusalem was by Arab Muslims. And when the Arab Muslims conquered Jerusalem, they in no way interfered with pilgrimages. There was no interference at all. So people went right on with pilgrimages as they had before. But eventually Jerusalem will be taken over by the Turks. And when the Turks take over, that begins a terrible persecution of the Christians. And at that point, then Christians as a group began to look at pilgrimage in a different way. Unlike the Jews and the Muslims, where pilgrimage is a goal, Mecca or Jerusalem, for Christians, pilgrimage is an experience, the experience of the process of the pilgrimage. And as a result of that, we have pilgrimages to Compostela, to Rome, to Jerusalem today, pilgrimages all over. There are people whose pilgrimage is to go to all the missions in California. People have pilgrimages of all kinds, okay? So they would look after pilgrims involved in these different pilgrimages. Monasteries had been doing this since their foundation. And one of the reasons is that Benedict's rule, one of the most important aspects of Benedict's rule, is hospitality. If you could put Benedict's rule down, there are three things that are big in Benedict's rule. Number one, listening to God. Number two, obedience to the abbot. And number three is hospitality to visitors. A visitor must be received as though the visitor is Jesus Christ. And so this whole thing was set up. And if you look at a map and see where monasteries are established, they were oftentimes established in order to provide housing for people who are on their way to pilgrimage. Okay? So now lay people understood that they in fact were the church, and there gradually grew up many lay organizations offering these services free to anyone in need. So they offered the hospitality, the care of the sick, and all this stuff was being offered offered for free. And it was being done by lay people. This was not really being done by the clergy. Most often, these different groups were actually founded by knights. And after the whole thing of knighthood was seen as a noble thing, the classic knight that you see in English literature, that they were very noble people who came from noble families and were involved in feats of battle, like they would have jousting and stuff like that. And they formed the core of any real army. And they were almost monastic in nature. The knights had a very strong organization, and when they stopped being soldiers and stuff like that, they often became very involved in charitable work of one kind or another So most of these were actually founded by knights. In 1118, Hugh de Payne and 8 companions formed the Knights Templar to protect pilgrims on the road between Jaffa and Jerusalem. Jaffa is a very little tiny town, and if you visit Tel Aviv today, you can visit Joppa. Joppa is the old city, and Tel Aviv has built up around it. And when you arrive in Israel, you arrive in Tel Aviv, assuming you arrive by plane, you'd arrive in Tel Aviv, and you take this road that goes from Tel Aviv. It goes through a valley that goes up to Jerusalem. And Jerusalem is up on a mountain, the highest point in the country. Well, I don't know if it's the highest. I think Mount Hermon is the highest. But anyway, it's a high mountain. And when you leave Tel Aviv, you are constantly ascending as you go up to Jerusalem. It's a very windy road now. It is exactly the same road they used. And today, when you go there, there are blown up tanks and military vehicles all over on either side of the road, because they're the very road that the Arabs used at times to attack Jerusalem, that they would come up this road. So anyway, the Knights Templar were sent to protect pilgrims. If you're going up a road like that, particularly slow and steep, it was very easy to suffer robberies and things like that. So Baldwin II was at this time the Christian king of Jerusalem. Jerusalem had been taken over by the Crusaders, and Baldwin was the king. And he installed the Knights Templars in the ruins of Solomon's Temple. If you visit Jerusalem today, you visit a large area that is basically the foundation of Solomon's Temple. And there are corridors and tunnels, and they're always discovering stuff new there. On top of it is built the Dome of the Rock, which is a mosque, and that sits on the very top of it. But at this time, that platform was given to the Knights Templar, and they lived basically in these corridors and everything, the rooms that were part of the foundation of the temple. The rule of life that they followed was written by Bernard of Clairvaux. Remember, we talked about Bernard of Clairvaux earlier, and he was involved in the Cistercians and the Carthusians, rather. And when he founded he was called the second founder of the Carthusians. And in his community, they had a very specific rule that they followed. And so this was picked up. Bernard of Clairvaux lived at the time of the Crusades, and he preached one of them anyway. Members could take vows for a period of time or life. So like if you were a knight and let's say you had a family and everything in someplace in France, you could join the Knights Templar, and you could go off to France, and off to Jerusalem rather, and defend that road for 2 or 3 years or something. You could do it as a penance. You know, oftentimes people are involved in war, and that happens even today. If you study the history of the United States, the number of monasteries in the United States tripled at the end of World War II. A lot of people, when they come back from war, have promised God if they would survive in one situation or another that they would go into a monastery, or they have seen so much of the ugly side of life, you do that in war, that they just wanted to get away from it. But whatever it is, it's very common for people at the end of that sort of thing to go into a life of penance of one kind or another. And so the monks would do that. There were several ranks in the order. Knights and chaplains all had to be of noble blood. So anyway, if you were a chaplain, a priest chaplain or you were one of the knights, you had to be of noble blood. Now understand, it's a huge organization. The knights are only one part of it, okay? The community as a community, was responsible to the Pope alone. Now, remember, we watched this with monasteries. When we saw the foundation of these different monasteries, like Cluny was responsible to the Pope alone. And when these organizations did that, they had a lot of independence. Like, for instance, if you're responsible to the bishop, things change as a bishop changes. Most religious orders, when they start, will start in a particular diocese under the bishop. And the order of its nature can change 3 or 4 times. Different bishops come in before it actually gets recognition and comes under the Pope. And then it becomes a very, very different thing in the way it's set up. So they were responsible to the Pope alone, which gave them a certain independence. They became extremely wealthy. Now, a lot of people believe their wealth came from the discovery of some treasures or something in the Temple of Solomon. But the fact of the matter is their wealth came from 2 things specifically. The lower thing that their wealth came from was gifts. See, the knights were all noblemen. And so it wouldn't be the least unusual that when the nobleman died, he gave all his lands to the Knights Templar. And one of the things that became a danger to the Knights Templar was in France, the Knights Templar owned more land than the King of France. And so they acquired land. But the thing that made them the wealthiest, where they really came from, they invented traveler's checks. And so if you were traveling, let's say you're a nobleman in France, and what you want to do is to travel to the Holy Land. You could put your money in with the Knights Templar in France, wherever it was, and get a paper that would indicate the amount of money. It would indicate that it was your money, and that there would be a set way in which you would verify that you were whoever it was, and then get the amount of money released to you when you went to Jerusalem. And of course, much like traveler's checks today, they took a cut off it. But that's where they really became wealthy. They would have people deposit money in their banks in Europe, then they give a note of deposit, and they could claim it in the Holy Land. Many important and very influential people would be thankful to the Knights Templar, and during their pilgrimage, they became very generous to the Knights Templar, both with land and money. As you can imagine, it was a very dangerous trip to set off on. And so the people who kept you safe, you really felt a debt to. And so they acquired a lot. By the 13th century, they were extremely wealthy. In fact, by the 13th century, I would say that the Knights Templar were wealthier than any individual king or authority on the face of the earth at the time. Many people wanted their money. In France, the king's name was Philip the Fair, and he actually wanted their land, as I mentioned. The king pressured the Pope. The Pope's name was Clement V, to suppress the community. And what he did was, as his head of the community, he basically disbanded it. He disbanded it. And when they were disbanded, then they were no longer under the authority of the Pope or the protection. And what happened is they were falsely accused of terrible sexual crimes. They were accused of all kinds of things, dealing with very bizarre sexual rites and things like that. And they were tortured, killed, and then the order itself was destroyed. It was under the Pope's, it was gone. So then it was suppressed. And it is considered in church history one of the most unjust actions that ever took place. They were innocent people. They suffered terribly. But you began to look at them and you realize their acquiring of the amount of money they did was not good. They should have gotten rid of the money. They were using it for a lot of things, but it made them very, very vulnerable, okay? So the people are always after money. In 1111, talk a little bit about Bernard of Clairvaux. Bernard of Clairvaux, and he's the guy who wrote the rule that the knights would use. He was born a nobleman in a castle near Dijon, France, place where the mustard's made. His mother tried to encourage a very strong spiritual life, but Bernard loved castle life, he loved parties, he loved hunts. He was given to the whole lifestyle of royalty at the time. He attended school, but never really finished. And when his mother died, and he was in the 20s, he had no direction or future for his life. He was just sort of drifting and living, the castle life in the 20s. We're told, now, see, like Bernard never talked about this, but we're told he had a vision of the child Jesus. And as a result of that vision of the child Jesus, he decided he had a call to monastic life. It says something about the power of the man that he decided to join the Cistercian Monastery in Cistercian, and he convinced 30 male relatives to go with him. So the 31 of them go off to join the monastery. Bernard eventually was sent with some other monks to establish a monastery in Clairvaux, France. Monasteries, when you get a certain number of people in the monastery, they send a group out to start a new one usually. The church the monks built under Bernard's direction. So Bernard went off with his group, and of course they built a church as part of the monastery, was Romanesque. And now we talked about Romanesque architecture earlier. It's very heavy, very few windows, and highly decorated. Well, Bernard took that architecture and did away with all the decoration. And it's called Cistercian Romanesque. It's a very specific kind of architecture. And again, in the ruins of their monasteries, you find these massive churches, if much of it is left. But there was no decoration on it at all. It was dedicated, Bernard was very dedicated to Mary. And so he dedicated this monastery. And for the rest of his life, he'll have a strong devotion to Mary. And one of the few surviving things in many of these Cistercian monasteries is a statue of the Virgin Mary that was part of the monastery somewhere. Bernard was made the abbot, and he would go on to assist in the foundation of 60 other Cistercian monasteries. And as a result of that, he's called the second founder of the Cistercians. And oftentimes we watch, probably the best religious order to watch this in is the Franciscans. Francis had a very specific way in which he wanted to live. And he wanted to live a life of pilgrimage, so that he wanted to travel around, never settle down, have a place or anything. Now, someone who wanted to follow him in that life was Claire, and women would not do what Francis wanted to do as far as living that way. So a monastery was established for Claire. And so at that point, then you see the Franciscans begin a monastery. And Francis didn't. He traveled around. He didn't want to own land, didn't want to own anything. He wanted to take food that people gave him and ate. He wanted nothing to do with money. Well, the Franciscans, over a period of time, then began to own houses, and as this happens, groups will break off to try and go to the original thing of Francis. So that today, there are dozens of Franciscan orders, and they break off, and they try and go through this reform. And sometimes the reform will reform the whole order in a very special way. And that's what happened here. Bernard of Clairvaux actually reformed the Cistercians. And so as the Cistercian community survived after Bernard of Clairvaux, it was after his idea. I'm going to close it here, but I'd also like to tell you one thing about people who are in the Diocese of Monterey, here where I am. North of us, there is a Trappist monastery, and Trappist monastery is in Vina, California. And they raise walnuts, and they're on a huge river there. I forget what the name of the river. But anyway, in their monastery, they have the chapter room from Clairvaux, where this was established. In our diocese here, we have Hearst Castle. And Hearst, when he wanted to put together the building that he wanted, he went all over Europe and bought art everywhere. And a lot of religious stuff was available. A lot of it was available in Spain, where churches were being looted during the Spanish Revolution, and that was being sold off to support the revolution. And the other thing is, in France, the churches, all church property belonged to the government after the French Revolution. And they would sell whole buildings to people, and Hearst bought several buildings and brought them over and used the rooms intact in his buildings. But anyway, when he finished building the castle, Hearst Castle, the room, the chapter room was left over from Clairvaux, and he gave it to the monastery in Vina. And so if you go up there today, you can see it. The chapter room is an assembly room where the monks would come together to discuss what needed to be done and vote on it. In true monastic thing, in the Cistercians, everything is done by a vote of the entire monastery. And then it's declared by the abbot, but he listens to everyone's views. Everyone has a right to speak, and it's called the chapter. But anyway, that building is in Vina, California, at the Trappist Monastery. Thank you very much. See you next week.